Good afternoon, and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. My name is Allison Padilla Goodman, and I am the Vice President for the Southern Division of ADL. I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's panel, Hate Crimes Legislation, Looking Back to Look Forward. Please join in the conversation on social media by posting and using the hashtag NeverIsNow. As ADL's lead on the recent historic passage of Georgia's hate crimes bill this past June, I'm thrilled for today's discussion where we have brought together experts from a variety of backgrounds to talk about hate crimes laws. After witnessing several high-profile mass hate-filled attacks, from Pittsburgh to Muncie to El Paso to Christchurch, I think the world understands how devastating hate crimes really are and how their impact reverberates well beyond the individual victims. And this conversation couldn't be more timely today. Just yesterday, the FBI released their latest hate crimes data, which showed another overall increase in hate crimes nationwide, including a 14% increase in anti-Jewish hate crimes and significant increases in hate crimes targeting other groups, especially anti-Hispanic hate crimes and gender identity biased hate crimes. The data also revealed the deadliest year on record, with a 113% increase in hate-motivated murders. In a few minutes, I will introduce our panel discussion. But before then, I want to dive into the role of one specific, very important set of advocates, the business community, looking through the lens of what happened in Georgia. As some of you may know, this June, after many years of vigorous advocacy, Georgia finally passed a hate crimes law. After inching its way through the Georgia legislature over the past 2 years, the bill truly got momentum when the video documenting the horrific murder of Ahmaud Arbery surfaced. ADL led the local coalition, Hate Free Georgia, of 35 organizations that have been pushing for hate crimes legislation for years in the state. This year, the bill finally passed through both houses of the Georgia legislature with wide bipartisan support, strong community support, and a huge push from Georgia's business community, which was particularly energized when Coca-Cola, a major force in Atlanta, got involved. So I am thrilled to welcome a special guest to start our program off, Monica Howard Douglas, Coca-Cola's General Counsel of North America. Monica has been with Coca-Cola for 16 years in a variety of roles, both in North America and South Africa, and has played very important roles in the company's current structure. Coca-Cola was instrumental in the passage of Georgia's hate crimes bill and is committed to working to secure passage of hate crimes bills in the remaining states that do not have them in the U.S., Arkansas, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming. Monica, thank you so much for being with us here today. So,
Thank
Monica,
you.
Monica, as you know, hate crimes legislation recently passed in Georgia, but it doesn't exist in those other states. Why did Coca-Cola decide to begin advocating for the passage of legislation in these states?
Sure. Thank you, Allison. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm really thrilled to join you today as we talk about the momentum that has really spread across the country with regards to hate crime legislation. The Coca-Cola Company is a supporter of the Anti-Defamation League, and we commend and thank you for your continued advocacy and efforts across the country. So we believe at the Coca-Cola Company that it's our duty to strive for equity and inclusion everywhere. We are a business that operates in every community in the United States, and we think it's important to support change and embrace policies that matter to the communities we serve. We've seen too many crimes committed in our communities that are based out of prejudice and bias, and that's our clear vision of inclusion. And that's why we joined efforts in Georgia earlier this year to support legislation to increase penalties for crimes committed out of this prejudice. And now we're helping to build and support local coalitions to advocate for similar hate crimes legislations in the few remaining states without such laws. We've joined broad coalitions of businesses and advocacy groups over the past several months to advance our efforts, working closely with experts like the ADL to advocate for passage of hate crimes legislation in the states where they don't currently exist. And we're thrilled that our collective advocacy has resulted in the passage of a comprehensive hate crimes bill in Georgia. It's our hometown, and we're so pleased that it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in the legislature. But we realize there's more work to be done. As this work progresses in South Carolina, Arkansas, and Wyoming, we are committed to continuing to listen, lead, invest, and advocate for greater equity.
Great. So speaking of your advocacy efforts in Georgia, can you share more about what you did with other business leaders to help ensure the legislation passed this year and why Coca-Cola's involvement was so important locally?
Yeah, we acknowledge that the hate crime bill successfully passed in Georgia this year because of the strong support of the Georgia business and civic community. Coca-Cola has been proud to call Atlanta, Georgia home since 1886. And we have a long history of taking a position on issues that matter to our community and bringing to life the values of our company. So through the leadership of the Georgia and Atlanta Metro Atlanta chambers and other groups like Georgia Equity, we rallied together to advocate for the swift passage of the legislation. The business community and our Coca-Cola leaders, we sent letters to the General Assembly urging the support. We engaged our employees who organized marches to the Dome and leveraged all of our resources internally and externally to get this legislation across the finish line.
Great. I remember when the letter came out from Coca-Cola, issuing your public support for the hate crimes bill, it was like a waterfall, and it was like every Georgia business came quickly thereafter. It was quite exciting. What impact have you seen from the passage of the Georgia hate crimes bill, both like in the community and for Coca-Cola's businesses?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal perspective, you walk a little lighter, and your head is held a little prouder. It was the right thing to do for Georgia, and it reflects not only the values of the Coca-Cola company and our collective business community, but also the values and reputations of our home state. Georgia has been ranked consistently as the top state to do business, but more importantly, it's a state that's so rich in diversity and culture. And so we want to maintain that reputation and retain the businesses that currently invest in the state and to ensure that we attract more and more talent. Inclusive policies are really critical to those efforts.
Yeah, that's great. It was a very proud month, I think, for Georgia when that bill passed and there was such strong bipartisan support. And really, it was a moment where everybody kind of came together in celebration. Why is support for strong hate crimes legislation actually a good business decision for Coca-Cola? I understand it was a big one.
Yeah, it was very big. And I think for a company that believes diversity and inclusion are among our greatest strengths, we put our resources and energy behind ending the cycle of systemic racism and supporting causes that advance equitable justice and inclusion for all people across the country. And like I said, we operate in communities where there's strong protections for diversity and inclusion and respect for everyone. And we think that's simply good business because when our communities thrive, our business thrives. I also wanted to share that our employees overwhelmingly believe it is our corporate and civic duty to lead on issues like this. And this is just one of the reasons why I'm personally proud to work for the Coca-Cola company and why I've stayed for the past 16 years. I come from a family of advocates, civil rights leaders, and I saw my future as kind of carrying that torch, but I never envisioned it would be in corporate America. But what I realized is working for a company like the Coca-Cola company has given me the platform to continue that work, to do good and to drive towards equity and inclusion. Our company's purpose is to refresh the world and make a difference. Advocating for hate crimes legislation in the communities we serve is a testament to our commitment to make a difference and lead with the power of long-standing inclusivity of our brands.
I love that, and really appreciate that notion. It was something I saw quite a bit once the hate crimes bill passed, was companies who really got involved felt like their employees were really happy. They felt like they were living their values and creating the world they wanted to live. And, just as somebody who was actively involved pushing for the hate crimes bill in Georgia for many years, I can't tell you how grateful we are for Coca-Cola's leadership and your pace setting. I mean, the business community was a huge asset in the bill's passage, and it was really powerful to have business leaders and community organizations and law enforcement all in sync on a single issue. I'm just hugely grateful to Coca-Cola, and thank you so much, Monica, for your leadership and for being with us here today.
Thank you.
I am now very privileged to introduce our esteemed panelists, each who brings an important and very different perspective to this discussion. Cynthia Deitel retired as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 2017 after serving for 22 years specializing in the fields of police brutality, hate crimes, public corruption, and community outreach. She currently works for the Matthew Shepard Foundation as their Director of Civil Rights Reform and primarily provides hate crimes training to state, local, and federal law enforcement officers and prosecutors. District Attorney Eric Gonzalez made history in November of 2017 when he became the first Latino district attorney elected in New York State. DA Gonzalez has implemented many trailblazing initiatives, including bail reform, a young adult court, expansion of non-prosecution of marijuana possession, a pre-court diversion program for low-level drug offenders, and a policy to reduce unfair immigration consequences in criminal cases. He also has launched a groundbreaking initiative known as Justice 2020 to help him carry out his vision of keeping Brooklyn safe and strengthening trust in our justice system by ensuring fairness and equal justice for all. Justice 2020 will transform the work of Gonzalez's office by shifting toward preventative and accountability solutions with a track record of success and away from an over-reliance on criminal convictions and incarceration. One of the 17 Justice 2020 recommendations was to create a dedicated point of contact for hate crimes. DA Gonzalez went beyond this recommendation to create a standalone hate crimes bureau, the only one in New York State, staffed with experienced senior prosecutors. He designated the bureau chief as the single point of contact for hate crimes charges. Fred Lawrence is the 10th secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, the nation's first and most prestigious honor society. He is also a distinguished lecturer at the Georgetown Law Center and has previously served as president of Brandeis University, dean of the George Washington University Law School, and visiting professor and senior research scholar at Yale Law School. An accomplished scholar, teacher, and attorney, Lawrence is one of the nation's leading experts on civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes, and he is the author of the book Punishing Hate, Bias Crimes Under American Law, Harvard University Press of 1999, a book that examines bias-motivated violence and how such violence is punished in the United States. He also was a former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York in the 1980s, where he became chief of the Civil Rights Unit. Welcome, everyone, and let's dive in. So we're going to start by laying out the landscape and then discussing some of the more complicated nuances of hate crimes legislation. I thought that we should start with a look at how we got to where we are. So maybe, Fred, you could start us off by giving us a very brief walkthrough of the history of hate crimes legislation and how these laws work. And of course, Cynthia or DA Gonzalez, feel free to pipe in on the contemporary landscape.
Thank you, Allison, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your leadership with ADL in Atlanta and the foundational work that you've done with the Georgia legislation. So in some ways, we could start way back at the time immediately after the American Civil War, when American law first really starts thinking about race as an issue and racial violence as a particular issue. But we're going to fast forward into the late part of the 20th century after several attempts to pass anti-lynching legislation that never makes it through Congress in the 30s and the 40s. The first glimmer in the 60s, you have criminal aspects of some of the civil rights acts, and then on the ground in the states where a lot of the action takes place, you have the growth of hate crime laws really in the 1970s and the 1980s, where there's a recognition that racial violence, which has existed in this country really since our inception, has to be viewed as a separate category. So you start to see this growth in many, many states in the 1980s. There are two sets of battles, three, I suppose. One is to increase the federal role. The second is increase the number of states. And then the third is in the courts. And there are issues that come up in the courts. Most prominently, the Supreme Court at one point looked as if it had declared the whole area of hate crime law unconstitutional in a case involving the cross-burning ordinance in St. Paul, Minnesota, saying you can't treat those crimes differently from other crimes. But influentially, in 1994, a case called Wisconsin against Mitchell, which ADL was very much involved in. I was privileged to be involved in the Wisconsin against Mitchell case. The Supreme Court upheld the Wisconsin hate crime statute and gave us a real model that said we weren't punishing people for their thoughts. We were punishing them for their actions that are a criminal manifestation of bias motivation that had a greater level of harm. This was the great recognition that we have been arguing for many years by that point, and that the court understood that hate crimes affect the victims more dramatically, they affect the target community more dramatically, and they affect the entire society by a tear along those very deep fissure lines in our society. So that sets the context for continued discussion in enhancing hate crime statutes in states, adding states, as just happened with Georgia. 4 states left to go, and it is very important that there be no blank spots on that hate crime list of all the states in the United States, and enhancing the federal role with legislation that provides the ability for the FBI and for the U.S. Attorney's offices and the Department of Justice to play an active role in the prosecution of bias-motivated violence.
I share that vision, and that the Wisconsin versus Mitchell case is really a very key piece of history, because when we were fighting for a hate crimes bill in Georgia, one of the most common rebuttals we would get is don't criminalize free speech and free thought, don't criminalize free speech and free thought. And we could come back to the Supreme Court and say, actually, there's precedent here. We know that it doesn't.
That's right.
Cynthia, do you want to talk a little bit about the Matthew Shepard, the kind of current law, federal law we have, and maybe add a little bit about why we even need a separate classification for bias-motivated crimes? Like, why are hate crimes important?
Thank you, Allison. I'm just honored to be a part of this panel, and longtime friend and partner with ADL and Coca-Cola. Thank you for everything you've done in Georgia, and we will look to you in the other 4 states to get us over the finish line. So thanks to both of you. The law that the FBI and the Department of Justice use today and have been using since 2009 is the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act. And as an FBI agent, I applauded the passage and enactment of that law because it gave the FBI and DOJ wide latitude and much greater jurisdiction in the hate crime space. And what it did is it transformed federal hate crime law in this country to make it much easier to prosecute acts of violence against people for who they are, for race, religion, national origin. For the first time, it included the LGBTQ plus community and disability, which was just a fantastic addition to the hate crime arsenal that we have in the statutes. So it greatly expanded the role of the FBI and DOJ in the space, which was great. And it's been used about 60 or so times since its passage in 2009 to not just prosecute anti-LGBT crimes, but crimes against Jews and Muslims and Hispanics and folks who are disabled. And it really made a great impact, not just to the victims who were impacted by the crime, but also to their communities and their families. So it really did, it really transformed hate crime law in this country. And hopefully with a new administration, maybe a new Congress, we can amend the Shepard Byrd law to include mandatory reporting and some other requirements, which I know is near and dear to the Anti-Defamation League's heart. But it was really just a breath of fresh air in the hate crime space.
Yeah, great. D.I. Gonzalez, your office is actively involved in investigating and prosecuting these crimes on the ground, and Brooklyn has been very busy with both hate crimes and anti-Semitic incidents. In 2019, ADL's annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents tracked 149 anti-Semitic incidents in your county alone. And of the 61 anti-Semitic assaults nationwide that we saw in 2019, 25 happened in your jurisdiction. I should also note that the latest hate crimes data from the FBI marks the highest number of reported hate crimes murders on records. What has your office been doing to address this challenge?
Thank you, Allison. I want to also thank ADL for having me as a guest today. To the other panelists, thank you for coming together. I want to agree immediately with what everyone else has said. Monica is correct. As the district attorney, it's my obligation to lead on issues of public safety and on issues that promote trust in our justice system. And as Professor Lawrence has said, and Cynthia has said, hate crimes play a very special role in making people feel unsafe. They feel unsafe because of the act itself. But unlike someone else who may be a victim of a crime, maybe they've got into a road rage situation, maybe there's a dispute with a neighbor, it does not make other community members feel that they are the next victim. In hate crimes, it has a really chilling impact on the entire community that you could be the next victim of this crime. When I was elected in 2017, we created a Justice 2020 platform, which is really an action plan of how we keep Brooklyn safe and promote confidence in our justice system. And I heard from community after community that the justice system seemed unduly harsh in a lot of ways. It had a lot of racial disparities and inequities, but in vulnerable communities, it seemed like not enough was done to enforce the law. And I made a pledge that in certain categories of cases, in gun violence, in gender-based violence, and in hate crimes, being a progressive prosecutor also meant putting more resources to solving these cases and making sure communities were safe. As you've said, Brooklyn has had a number of incidents. It really started to uptick in 2018 at the end of the year, and I created a dedicated hate crimes bureau. So that bureau is a standalone bureau. It does not handle other cases other than the investigations and prosecution of hate crimes. There are 12 members of that bureau, up to 8 lawyers and support staff. So a really large bureau, even in an office of my size, to put that amount of resources into handling hate crimes. And I think it's important that the community understands that we will do everything in our power to prosecute hate crimes when it happens, but also to be on the forefront of prosecution, but also preventative measures. And so that's what's happening here in Brooklyn. We have the largest Jewish population in this borough outside of Israel. And so the community has seen a number of ups and downs. And, quite frankly, since 2018, we've seen increases in New York City. This year, we're down substantially in hate crimes in Brooklyn. But I fear that is really a result of COVID and not because of enforcement actions. But largely, I think my obligations really center around 3 things, which is making sure that these cases are reported, that they're actively investigated, and that cases actually result in arrest. When I came into office, so few of these cases were actually reported, and even fewer were successfully prosecuted. And so that is the challenge that we have here. But having such a dedicated team and working very closely with the New York City Police Department, we've made tremendous progress in sort of getting out the word that these cases will be taken very seriously. But I don't want to underestimate the damage and the trauma that this causes an entire community. My prosecutors are trained to be culturally competent in understanding how to do these interviews, but also in trauma-informed interviewing techniques so that we can get these cases reported. And the biggest thing that I think we made a lot of success with last year, visiting so many synagogues and other places in terms of anti-Semitic crimes, is making sure that all of the crimes get reported. That was something that I had seen as a lot of underreporting. We still see that as an issue, but we're working to make sure that even if the police department doesn't categorize something as a hate crime, that we are tracking it internally in this office in a different way.
Great. That's really, I really appreciate your leadership here. I appreciate your recognition of the double impact of hate crimes and also your commitment to resource and getting these rights. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on how the kind of special prosecutors are trained? I think that piece of training investigators is really important and people would like to know.
Well, the goal is to make them experts in this area of the law. The prosecution of hate crimes in New York State, there's a number of additional burdens that are placed on these cases. The biggest burden is not just establishing that the crime took place in whole or a substantial part due to bias or animus, but also really establishing the motive behind the crime. A lot of these cases, whether it be something that comes through as an assault, there's often not anything said that can be deemed to be animus. Sometimes the attacks seem at random, and it's really a burden to establish that the perpetrator committed the crime because of animus. And so we have to get behind the scenes. We're looking at video, we're getting on social media, we're trying to look at membership in organizations. There's been a tremendous increase in membership in white supremacist type activity. We've seen something in Brooklyn that I have never seen in 25 years in prosecution before. We saw white supremacists marching in New York City last year. And so this is really where the expertise comes in, knowing how to make these arguments and also understanding the preventative aspects as well. And we've been working with ADL and other members to do trainings to try to, especially with our younger population, try to prevent these incidents from happening. One of the most disconcerting things that happened last year in particular was the number of hate crimes that were committed by juveniles against other juveniles mostly, but sometimes against adults, and trying to understand what was the motivating factor of these younger population, what's generating the hate. And so we've been working very carefully with partners like ADL to try to get into the high schools, to even sometimes the junior high schools, to teach a curriculum that it's more than just tolerance. It's about doing the right thing and not allowing these kind of racial tropes and other anti-Semitic things to be said or done without real scrutiny being placed on that. And I think that is one of the things that we've done in our office. I want to be clear. We see three types of hate crimes. They usually fall into three buckets. The juvenile cases, which are often property crimes. Occasionally there are physical attacks. We also see a number of crimes of people with significant mental health issues with long histories of mental health. And then we really do see the people who are, actively motivated by animus committing these crimes. And so the solutions to these cases are, being very vigorous, having dedicated professionals working on these cases, but also trying to understand what we're trying to accomplish in each one of these. And in some of those cases, it's really going to be, we want aggressive prosecution that's going to lead into incarceration. And in some of the cases, we're looking at restorative programs that are meant, especially for our younger population, so they can realize the harm that they've caused, not only the individual victim, but the entire community. And we see that in every covered category. We've seen a tremendous increase in LGBTQ hate crimes, as well as this year a number of anti-Asian hate crimes related and surrounded to the coronavirus.
We've got some great questions coming in the chat that we will get to in just a minute. I want to get back to some of the core pieces of defining a hate crime. So hate crimes laws generally aim to cover immutable characteristics, the things that you cannot or should not have to change about yourself, like your race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. There have been some debates and some legislative efforts, some successful, to include other categories like immigration status, homelessness, and first responders like law enforcement and EMS providers. How similar or different do you think these categories are from the immutable characteristics? And do you share ADL's view that they should generally not be included in a hate crimes bill? Who wants to jump at it?
I'll take an initial stab and then happily turn it over. My initial thought when this question comes up is always including someone in law enforcement in a hate crime statute as a protected class. That was never the intention of hate crime statutes in the beginning. And Fred did a really good job of talking about hate crime statutes early in our nation's history. I think in some states we've seen, and even some municipalities, the number of categories has just exploded. Pregnant women, I know that comes up as a category besides first responders, military, the list goes on and on. The whole purpose of hate crime laws was to send a signal to society that crimes that are motivated, as you said, by a characteristic that you cannot or should not change is far different than your profession. So saying that crimes against someone of the Jewish faith, that is far different than a crime committed because you are homeless or because you are in the military or because you are a law enforcement official. You don't have a right to be a law enforcement official. So you can change that if you want to. Not that you should, not that you would have to do that, but that was never the intention of hate crime laws. It was really to protect the most vulnerable in our society, minority members, disenfranchised populations, people who were distrustful of law enforcement. Those were the groups to whom these laws were designed to protect. And I think those original arguments and original intent, I think that's right in my view.
Yeah, I agree with Cynthia. Sorry, Professor, after you.
No, but I'm just going to say that I think, Cynthia is clearly right that one of the major purposes of hate crime laws has been to protect disadvantaged groups. It's also a recognition of what I've called social fissure lines where a society splits in a particularly dangerous way. There's a reason why these crimes have this very dangerous multiplier effect out into the society. We talk about polarization today in many ways, but the idea that racial crimes, religious crimes, they stigmatize an individual group, but they also hit society on a very dangerous split line. It's interesting that the very act of deciding what's in a hate crime law is a self-definitional act for a society how inclusive are we? How diverse are we? I'm glad today we can celebrate what Georgia has done with the leadership of ADL and Coca-Cola and others. But if you go back in time, I'm afraid Georgia gives us a really good example of exactly what the problem was. There was a time when a bill was on the floor of the Georgia state legislature, and a member of the legislature stood up referring to one aspect of it. It was the LGBTQ plus aspect of a proposal, and he said, "We don't want to validate that lifestyle in this state." Now, he got most of that terribly wrong in terms of, first of all, calling it a lifestyle, and secondly, the bigotry that represented. But he got one part right, and the part he got right is that's exactly what was on the docket. That's exactly what was being talked about. Were the people of Georgia going to say that we recognize the LGBTQ plus community as part of us, or are we not? That's the statement that you make. So these are definitional acts. Now, are police officers, is that a definitional line? Is that a split in society? No, I think it answers itself. So with each of these categories, you would ask yourself, does it fit into that category of being something in which society splits in that kind of very dangerous and self-definitional way?
And what our hate crime laws are really about, it's not that hate crimes is a category, a chargeable category, at least not in New York State. It's a sentencing or punishment enhancement. It's meant to be something that we can add on. So in New York, what we do is it elevates the crime to one level up. So if it's a class A misdemeanor, it becomes a felony. And if it's a felony, it goes up 1 degree. And so that there's the ability for a court upon a conviction to do the enhancement and sentence the person appropriately. But I agree that these laws should be about who we are, immutable characteristics that we can't control, that people should be able to leave their homes and be safe and secure, and that the community should know that when people are attacked because of who they are, that we will, or who they perceive to be, we will take action as a civilized society to punish that behavior. There are other laws, right? In New York, we have laws that protect police officers by having certain enhancements. We protect other first responders in ways. And I believe, even for the immigration point in New York, under New York state law, we also protect national origin and ancestry. And so that there are ways of doing this work, but that we should limit a hate crime. When we call something a hate crime, it should be something that we are saying is so beyond what our society should be, that conduct is so morally blameworthy that it deserves that type of enhancement. And, this work is really important because even in a place like New York City that is, believed to be a very progressive and, liberal type city, there's so much segregation in New York City. And, I'll speak for myself that I grew up in a, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I never had a white classmate until I went to high school. And so we grew up not knowing each other. We grew up very separate, and we need to make sure that these laws are there to protect that kind of, as the professor said, those kinds of tensions when when people are attacked because of who they are, not because what they do for a living.
I love this. There was a question in the chat that D.A. Gonzalez, you kind of addressed for New York. Somebody wanted to know if there are already statutes kind of offering protection to law enforcement and other vulnerable communities besides a hate crime statute.
Yes, in New York, and actually fairly substantive protections.
Fred, do you have any insight on that?
If you an assault of a federal officer, even if it's a standard assault, which would be a state law crime, that all of a sudden becomes a federal crime. So that actually involves the FBI and a U.S. attorney. So in that, and it turns out, the Supreme Court held a long time ago, that's even true if you didn't know it was an FBI officer, if you didn't know it was a federal agent. So it's not even in that case one of intent. That just says when those people are victimized, the federal government will step in and play a role. So I think there's a temptation, and sometimes I think it's actually a understandable, positive temptation. The hate crimes is a serious area of law. Let's use it for everything. The problem is if you use it for everything, you use it for nothing. You lose the very powerful sanction that we're talking about. Look, Cynthia was talking about the Matthew Shepard Act. We started working on what became the Matthew Shepard Act in the mid-late 1990s. It came false almost every possible way it could. We had a president who would have signed it and a Senate that would have approved it, but a House that wouldn't. Every configuration that could go wrong until 2009. I've been at other signing ceremonies. I've never been at one where there was many moist eyes in the room, and I'm not embarrassed to say mine included, because people understood what the power of this statement was, that something is being labeled as a hate crime, which means that the victims of it say that extra hate, that extra harm that I felt, that's been validated by my society. If you deplete that, you've lost one of the most important aspects of a hate crime law.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and I also think that the hate crimes are about being selected. The perpetrator is selecting you because of who you are or what they perceive you to be. That's different, and then adding all of these other categories, right? That in fact the reason why you're being selected to commit this crime is because of these immutable characteristics, and I think that we can't lose that. That's the intent behind this, is to protect people from being selected for hate because of what someone thinks they are or how they're perceived.
Cynthia, were you trying to jump in?
I was just going to
Okay.
answer the question, I think. So I think there are jurisdictions that do protect law enforcement, which I think was your original question in the states. I don't think it's the predominant motivating factor for the state hate crime laws, but I do think it exists. And to Professor's comment about FBI agents and having the special law protecting agents, I'm probably going to get a lot of hate mail because of this, but I never understood why there was a special law that protected me as an FBI agent from attack. I didn't see myself as any more unique or different than anybody else who worked for the government or who, responded to a hate crime or responded to a bank robbery or responded to another federal crime. But I was always a little uncomfortable with that law. I didn't think I was any more unique or special than anybody else, and I could retire or quit and the law wouldn't apply to me anymore. So I could come and go, and I just thought it was kind of strange. So even as it applied to me and as it protected me as an FBI agent for 22 years, I didn't think that law should be on the books. But so I don't think it should be on the law in the states either.
Hey, Allison, I'm just going to jump in there and say that as an assistant U.S. attorney who had FBI agents working for us on those cases, Cynthia, there's a reason we protected people like you, because we take care of our own. And I relied on my agents and I trusted them, with my life.
Well, let's kind of pivot for a minute. So the latest FBI data that was released yesterday on gender identity bias motivated crimes is startling. So this year's data shows a 6-fold increase in the number of gender identity hate crimes since the FBI began collecting this data in 2013. Yet, at least 31 states still do not cover gender identity as a protected category in their state hate crimes bill. The Georgia bill that recently passed had gender identity removed from its original language, but sex and gender were included. So after the recent Supreme Court ruling in the Bostock case, broadly interpreting discrimination on the basis of sex, I think there is some confusion as to whether sex and gender covers gender identity biased hate crimes. Fred, why don't you start us off on this? What's your view on this?
Well, let me start with the legislative issue. And I regret to say, I think that there's actually a connection between the increased levels of violence against LGBTQ people on the one hand, and those states that are resistant of putting sexual identity and sexual orientation in the statutes. And that part of this really is about a fear that people have of a society that they perceive changing, and they perceive it as changing out from under them. And even if that fear, to a certain extent, it can be validated, the criminal manifestations of it and the violent manifestations of it certainly cannot be, and it expresses itself as hate. So that same Georgia legislator who back in the 90s was saying, we don't want to validate that lifestyle, there's a little taste of that. Here we are 30 years later, a little taste of that in the current Georgia statute. Now, the Supreme Court did say in the employment discrimination area that there is no distinction essentially between sexual orientation, sexual identity, and gender, because it's all on the basis of gender. My guess is that courts would not interpret hate crime laws the same way. There is a rule in criminal cases that you define and you interpret laws in the way that is most generous and advantageous to the defendant and more strictly towards the state. There's a good reason for that. You want to be very careful when you use the criminal sanction and the criminal statute. So I really think the action here should not be looking to the courts to fix what the legislature didn't do. It should be to impress upon legislatures both the importance of the positive statement of including LGBTQ people within the umbrella of protection of hate crime laws. And now let me flip it around. And also the statement they're making the other way. The idea of saying we're not making a statement about this, that's not on the menu. You are making a statement. Whatever the hate crime law doesn't include makes a statement. It says that these kinds of people are less included, are less protected in this state. So I think the effort has to be to make that loud and clear. Is that the statement that you wish to make? And so I don't want to give Coca-Cola homework to do after all the good work they've done. But you know, there's the work is great and the day is short, and we all have a lot on our plates to keep going forward with. And I think that Georgia law has to be amended, and laws that don't include sexual identity have to be amended, and they have to be amended to include sexual identity and sexual orientation, precisely because of the statement that it makes to include or not include those characteristics and those people within the umbrella of the protection of hate crime laws.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with our constitutional scholar. I will say that I think that sex, the definition of sex, if I'm the prosecutor in Georgia, that I would say that it has to include sexual orientation, and I think that it's important that a prosecutor there bring the case, charge it, litigate it. Gender identity, sexual orientation has to be included in a robust hate crimes law, and I think it's incumbent on the DAs there to try to bring that level of protection. It's clearly going to get litigated, but the sooner the better, because in my county, in Brooklyn, there's over 2.5 million people in Brooklyn. I think that the most underreported hate crime is in the LGBTQ community. There are a lot of reasons for that, but it is something that we continuously see as an area where people are harassed because of who they are. And as a prosecutor, your obligation is to pursue justice and safety in your community. And so you have to try to push the envelope there and litigate it.
Cynthia, you want to add anything? You good?
I was only going to add one point, that if you look at some research that's been done about the types of hate crimes committed against especially the trans community and the LGBTQ community, you'll see that the level of violence, the person-to-person crime, is very extreme. So these folks are not just targeted for violence and intimidation and harassment, but they are targeted in a very vicious and violent way. And we've seen that with the uptick in murders of trans women of color, especially throughout the South. I think our hate crime laws all across the board have to protect gender and gender identity, our trans friends. It has to. They are probably one of the most vulnerable populations in our society that need that protection.
It's a really important point. Thank you for adding that. We have a few questions about law enforcement reporting in the chat. And Year after year, we seem to have issues with some law enforcement agencies underreporting hate crimes. In the data released yesterday, 15,588 law enforcement agencies participated in hate crimes reporting, which is the third highest level of participation since the enactment of the Hate Crime Statistics Act in 1990, but it's still a slight decrease from the past 2 years. Why do you think there is an issue with underreporting? Why are law enforcement agencies hesitant to report? And what can we do about it?
I'd love to jump in on that, if I may, to give a complete shout out to Jeremy Shaver, who is your Rocky Mountain director in the Anti-Defamation League, and he's housed in Denver. He had a really good idea a couple weeks ago to pull together law enforcement leaders within Colorado to ask them these questions. What's going on with hate crime reporting? And it was instructive to be included in that discussion and to ask them, why do you report? Why do you not report? What are the obstacles and challenges that you face in reporting or not reporting? And we heard so many different answers from chiefs and from sheriffs about their confusion in how to report and drop-down menus and which box should I check, but my sheriff doesn't need me to do that. And there was a myriad of reasons as to why their reporting was wholly insufficient. And I've learned that as well, traveling the country, doing hate crime training. I have asked departments that historically do not report their hate crime data, why don't they? And I get a whole lot of reasons why they don't, all that are very fixable in my view. But I think it's department by department as to why their reporting is either fantastic, like Phoenix, for example, or Boston, or the New York City Police Department, why some departments do it really well and some don't do it at all. But it's like politics, it's very local, and you really have to drill down into why their reporting is really good or really terrible or non-existent. But again, I think that when you ask these questions and when you talk to chiefs and sheriffs about the importance of reporting, I think they really begin to understand that they need to do better in this space and really really practice what they preach in data-driven policing so that they know where the criminal threats are, they can address the threats, they can prevent hate crimes from occurring, and they can show the community that these types of crimes are very, very important. But it's an interesting body of research to figure out why the research is so bad.
Well, Cynthia is good to do the work that she does, and if there are enough Cynthias to go around to go to every department, I bet we could fix some of those problems. At the same time as we do that,
I'm getting there.
I bet you are, but there's also a top-down, not solution, but part of this is, incentives are good for all of us. The Hate Crime Statistics Act which is a federal statute, but it's only as good as the local law enforcement reporting to the FBI to collect those data. So there's a lot of federal support that goes to local law enforcement. Some of it is just actual dollars, and some of it is backup, and all sorts of ways the federal government provides support to local law enforcement, which they should. It could also be conditioned on reporting. And that would certainly make a lot of departments that don't put as high a priority on as they might. Maybe they all of a sudden start calling Cynthia and say, we need to get you here by the end of the fiscal year, or otherwise we're going to lose our funding. So maybe that shouldn't be necessary, but in the meantime, and she'll come. And so, I think if we say it's important, you're right, Allison, the numbers have been, good the last few years, but they should be perfect. Why are we having this conversation? Why aren't they 100%? It's ludicrous that it shouldn't be 100%. And unfortunately, there are some departments that are chronic underreporters or non-reporters, and they are in places where there's every reason to believe that there are at least significant levels of bias-motivated violence. So that's not the answer. So I think more attention and incentivizing from the federal level would go a long way.
So we have so many great questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to squeeze in one more before we have to conclude. So once hate crimes have been kind of reported and investigated and tried, what is the best way to handle offenders, and how can we ensure that justice is done and the crimes are not repeated. There was one question in particular that there were several questions about this and about alternative sentencing. And there was one that even added, once people are arrested, are their weapons taken away from them? Are they prohibited from buying guns going forward? I mean, what do we do with perpetrators of hate crimes? And maybe D.A. Gonzalez, can we start with you on this one?
I think obviously we have to make sure that these cases are treated very seriously, and that the community at large understands that these are among the most vile crimes that we face in our criminal justice system. I started to mention before that in Brooklyn, they seem to fall into three categories. We have a number of cases that involve juveniles. We have a number of cases that involve mental health, and then we have really bias-related incidents that are about racial animus. And I think that all three of them sort of need to be handled in different ways. All of them are serious. All of them cause harm. It doesn't matter if it's a juvenile or someone with a mental health issue, that the harm that it causes and the fear that exists in the community is the same. But the law enforcement response has to make sense. And so the law enforcement response, if I'm dealing with someone who's homeless or mentally ill, what I'm trying to do is about accountability. What I'm trying to do is to make sure that the community understands that we won't tolerate this. And I'm trying to make sure that this person never causes harm again. So in terms of mental illness, sending someone to jail for a short stay in jail without dealing with their underlying mental health conditions does not make a lot of sense. We want to make sure that we're wrapping our services around this person, that we're stabilizing them, and we're trying to get to the underlying cause of their behavior. Is it racial animus, or is it something different? We had a case in Brooklyn where one of our houses of worship, a synagogue, had been defaced with anti-Semitic hate crimes, language, and it was shocking, and it garnered a lot of attention locally, and I think even nationally. It turned out that the perpetrator of that crime was a member of that synagogue who had become, had a long mental health history, had been off their medication, and had responded in this way. And so once the community understood that this was the cause of this action, and it was still harmful and it still hurt the community, it still created fear, what they were looking for was different. And so that was a case where we were able to work with supportive housing and mental health issues, getting someone on their medicine regimen and returning them safely into the community. It didn't happen overnight. They were still separated from the community for a period of time, but it made a difference. For young people, we're working with a restorative justice model, trying to make sure that they understand the nature of the crime that they've committed. Many of them really don't understand, for example, the significance of a SWAT sticker. They know they're doing something that's provocative, but do they really understand what the meaning behind that is? And we've seen in our work here that a lot of our young people do not exactly know what they're doing and how fearful and angry that symbol can be. And so we've had them go to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. We've had them sit down with Holocaust survivors. We've had them work to make, hear some of the harm that they've caused within their community, speak to other young people, and handle those cases appropriately in that manner. But we've also had our share of violent, hateful people. And in those cases, there's no hesitation. They should be separated from our society. They should be incarcerated. And we should make sure that we're deterring future acts of violence by protecting our community. And so we've been doing a little bit of everything, but it's really with the goal of long-term safety in our community and the understanding that as a law enforcement agency, we must say that certain crimes can't be mitigated by simply saying, I'm sorry. Certain crimes require accountability measures that include long prison sentences because that's what justice demands in those individual cases.
I think I speak for everybody listening. I'm really inspired by this commitment to both justice and restoration and kind of creating a full circle. We could continue this conversation, it feels like, for at least another hour. I am like full and ignited and ready to pass a hate crimes bill in South Carolina. Again, if you are joining us and seeking CLE credit, please make sure you note the second CLE code. I am just incredibly grateful to our esteemed speakers today, Monica Howard Douglas, Cynthia Deitel, District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, and Dr. Fred Lawrence, not only for being with us today and sharing your important insight and experiences, but for the incredibly important work you do for all of us in pursuing justice and fair treatment for all every day. We at ADL are just incredibly grateful for your partnership. Before you go, please visit the Never Is Now website to see the full slate of panels from subject matter experts from around the country. You can go to neverisnow.org to attend sessions. Also, if you are interested in seeing a session that has already happened, the same site will house all past panels, so you can watch everything and you can tell your friends to watch this one again, or you could just watch it again and again, as I probably will. Never Is Now resumes on this Thursday, the 19th, from 2 to 3 Eastern Standard Time. I will see y'all there. And thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to justice.